Hi, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Beat the Bar. This is a very special episode. We're talking about something I think that gets kind of lost in the shuffle, and so I wanted to give it its own episode, and this is going to be strict liability. We're not going to confuse it with that other thing. It talks about products, product liability, even though we know sometimes that with certain products we sometimes think about this whole thing. No, we're going to keep it totally separate. And I hope part of that you may have noticed, right? I look a little different today. We don't have the vest. I've got this awesome elephant tie on. And why might I wear this elephant tie, aside from the fact that it is just pretty awesome? It is because with strict liability, we are only ever really talking about two things. We're talking about wild animals, and we are talking about abnormally dangerous activities, blasting, right? Things that go boom, dynamite explosions, right? Those are the two things. So if we're talking about wild animals, things that go kaboom, we are going to be talking about strict liability. And so for that reason, we are going to have a little bit of, I think we try to have fun in all the videos, right? But we're going to specifically tackle these topics, and hopefully you can learn how to keep them separate and distinct from the other stuff that we talk about in torts, some of the stuff having to deal with products, and we know that those same two words, strict and liability, kind of get thrown around in there. So with that little intro out of the way, let's dive into this. Okay, so what's the simplest way we can understand strict liability? It's that if we see a wild animal in the fact pattern, an elephant, a tiger, a bear, right, whatever. If we see a wild animal in the fact pattern, we are automatically thinking strict liability. As I say in many other areas, does that mean the answer is automatically going to be strict liability? No. Does it mean they are testing you on the concept, on the part of the bar outline that talks about strict liability? Yes, 99% of the time. Could there be a wild animal present in a fact pattern that talks about something else? Yeah, I guess maybe, but here's the point. If we know we're doing a torts question, and we know that this torts question involves a wild animal, I keep an alligator in my kitchen, right? If we have that type of a situation, then automatically we're thinking about strict liability. As we'll see, what does strict liability mean? Strict liability essentially means that if the harm materializes, if the harm comes about as a result of this wild animal being a wild animal, and we'll talk about when that might not be the case. But if the harm comes about because this is a wild animal, then we are going to say that the person who owns the wild animal, person who's responsible for it, is going to be strictly liable, which means they're liable, right? It doesn't matter if the alligator was chained, if I had taken all of the reasonable precautions that you might take to keep an alligator safely in a kitchen. The point is, as we know, you can't keep an alligator safely in a kitchen. And so therefore, anything that happens, I'm going to be strictly liable for. Okay, so let's now understand this a little bit more. Now, as you guys probably know, the only real wild animal in my kitchen is our little dog, Corbett. And he does not meet the, even though he is absolutely wild, the dude is insane, he's not technically, for MBE purposes, a wild animal, right? So what's the distinction? If we have our typical domestic pets, cat, dog, a gerbil, any of my fellow law school parents out there, we got Jelly Bean from Coco Melon. The kids love Jelly Bean, right? If we have a domestic pet and the domestic pet bites you, harms you, injures you, if you come over the house, and Corbett would never bite you, but let's say let's say little Maddie, in a couple years, she's at school and she brings home the class gerbil, and the class gerbil bites. I hope they don't still have class gerbils. That's kind of nasty. Maybe you're a gerbil person. If so, I'm sorry. But let's say that even if you are a gerbil person, you come over the house, oh, hey, this is so awesome. Here's this little hamster, little gerbil, and oh, I bit you on the finger. Is Bob strictly liable? Answer choice A is going to say no, because Bob didn't own the gerbil. Is that a stupid answer? Yes, because I had control of the gerbil. Answer choice B is going to say no, because Bob had no reason to know that the gerbil was going to bite anyone. That's going to be the correct answer. Why is that going to be the correct answer? And I would have to give you a few more facts, but here's the idea. If it's a domestic animal and I'm taking reasonable precautions with it, and that animal has no history of attacking or injuring people, then I'm not going to be strictly liable for it, right? So if it's a domestic animal, cat, dog, whatever, I'm not going to be strictly liable. Now, let's say, because we've all seen this, we've all lived in the neighborhoods where, you know, you have the quote unquote the devil dog, and no, of course, I'm not talking about the real devil dogs, right? My Marine Corps friends, love you. We're not talking about that. We are talking about the dog that looks like an actual demon, right? Foaming at the mouth, and it's going to get you. So let's say this dog, and again, this dog is, we're not talking about like the cases where people, it's not really a dog, but it's a wolf. Those are out there. We'll talk about that. But no, this is actually a dog, right? A regular dog, but it so happens that this dog has a history of attacking people, of biting them. If we're talking about that type of a dog that has a history of biting people, and I own that dog, and then you come over and the dog bites you, am I going to be strictly liable at that point? Yes, but only because the dog has a history of biting people. So again, generally speaking, am I strictly liable for a dog bite, for an animal, if the gerbil bites you on the finger? No. Why am I not strictly liable for that? Because even if I own the animal, right? But if the animal has no history of violence, if it has no history of aggression, and it's just a regular domestic animal that people keep as pets, as long as I'm taking reasonable care, then I'm not going to be liable if it bites you, right? We use the regular torts stuff, what we talked about in the other torts video. The idea is we take reasonable precautions, right? We avoid foreseeable risks, and that's what a reasonably prudent person does, and we just apply that same standard. Okay, now back to the fun, back to the wild animal. Let's say it's not a dog. Let's say instead it really is a wolf or a tiger in the backyard. If the wild animal bites you, attacks you, whatever, am I going to be strictly liable? Yes. Bob, this seems pretty easy. Yeah, so far it is. Here is the wrinkle. Here's where this gets a little bit more complicated. They will set up the fact pattern like this. I tell you, hey, I have this really cool tiger chained up in my backyard. And then I say, yeah, no, don't worry, the tiger's awesome, and I have it declawed and defanged, and it's, you know, we got tranquilizers in the thing 24/7, and it's not going to harm anyone. It's completely docile. It's just, you know, sleeping there, right? You come over and you see the tiger and you freak out because you're there in person and it's like, holy crap, there's a tiger right there in front of you, and you freak out and you turn around and you run away, and as you're running away, you blow out your knee, right? God forbid, your meniscus gone. Am I going to be strictly liable? Yes. Yes. But Bob, you gave me all these facts about how tiger was defanged and declawed and completely docile. Doesn't matter. If I am the owner of a wild animal, if I am keeping a wild animal and you come over and you sustain some harm as a result of that's a wild animal, as in I was scared, I ran away because that's a wild animal, and I blew out my knee in the process, is Bob going to be strictly liable? Yes. What's the only scenario involving a wild animal that I keep as a pet where I wouldn't be strictly liable for an injury that happens. I'll give it to you like this. I want you to come over to my house, but I know that if you know that I have a tiger in the basement, you're probably not going to come over. So I don't tell you that there's a tiger in the basement, but I also don't want the tiger to eat you. So I keep the tiger, same thing, declawed, defanged, sedated, and the tiger is just down there in the basement. And let's just say in this crazy hypo that all the lights are off in the basement. You say, hey, I want to go get a Coke, or, okay, hey, there's a fridge downstairs. Go run down. Why don't you grab us too? You run down the stairs and it's completely dark and you trip over what you think is the corner of the couch. And you fall down and you break your leg or you blow out your knee again. Unbeknownst to you, it wasn't the corner of the couch that you tripped over. It was the corner of my tiger. My tiger was asleep because he was sedated. You didn't realize that it was a tiger. You just bumped into it, hurt yourself, and then afterwards you want to sue me because I have this tiger in the basement that you fell over. Well, what is the key factual distinction here? In that second case, the harm didn't materialize because it was a wild animal. In other words, if it had been a couch there, you fell over it, you would have gotten hurt the same way. You didn't get the harm because it was a wild animal. So what's the thing we really have to pay attention to here? How did the harm materialize? Did you see that it was a tiger, start running away and hurt yourself? If so, I'm strictly liable. If you tripped over it because you didn't know it was a tiger, am I strictly liable? No. Is that like the really, really, really rare exception? Yes. The only thing that you want to be aware of with this is where, okay, if the harm materializes in this other way, then we're not going to have this strict liability. So that is the wild animal piece. Next, let's talk about the other piece, which is the abnormally dangerous activities. This one is pretty straightforward. Blasting. It's not the only thing that would fall into this. Really, any type of abnormally dangerous activity. That's what we should say about it. It's going to be wild animals and abnormally dangerous activities. So if I am the guys that transport the spent nuclear fuel rods across the country, if I am dealing with dangerous chemicals, if I am doing anything that is abnormally dangerous. Obviously, the simplest one, the one you probably remember from law school, of course, is the blasting, the dynamite, right? And how does this get tested? Well, we know that if the defendant ultimately is engaged in abnormally dangerous activity, so I'm doing whatever I'm doing and it has an unusually high risk of causing this severe harm, and harm occurs, then I'm going to be strictly liable. I'm going to be strictly liable unless the facts specifically tell you that the plaintiff, the person who got injured, assumed the risk, right? They have to knowingly assume the risk. And so how will they will lay this out to you very, very specifically. They will say that the section of the freeway or the section of the road, whatever, is closed. And there's a bunch of signs up. Blasting in progress, do not proceed here, proceed at your own risk kind of thing. And our plaintiff sees the signs and is aware of the danger, but says, you know what, I really got to get across town here and I don't feel like sitting in traffic on the freeway, so I'm going to take the shortcut through the blasting zone. If our plaintiff does that, if they assume the risk and they get injured, then is there a defense to the strict liability? Yes. But how is this most commonly tested? They do this like I talk about with the search and seizure stuff. They will give you a scenario where there's blasting on the freeway. Somebody's driving by, and maybe they see in the distance there's the sign that says blasting in progress, but they're just driving on the freeway. And before they have a chance to turn or do anything or even react to the sign, right, as they're still driving, a piece of debris comes out from the rock or comes off, whatever, and hits the car and injures them. And so the question is, is the blasting company going to be liable? And answer choice A is going to say yes, because they were using dynamite. And answer choice D is going to say no, if the plaintiff assumed the risk. Bob, you just told me that if the plaintiff assumed the risk, that there would be a defense. But guys, did the facts tell you that my plaintiff assumed the risk? No, the plaintiff was just driving. Maybe they saw that there was blasting going on ahead, right? But if it's not a situation where they have crossed over into that space, right, where they have taken some knowing assumption of the risk, and the facts will be super clear if that's happening or not. If it's just they happen to be in the vicinity of this blasting and they get injured, did they assume the risk just because they were there? No, and that's the distinction. Do you see, right? So if they are telling you in the facts that this person is consciously assuming this risk, that they see the signs for the blasting and they proceed anyway into that zone, okay, then is assumption of the risk something we could be talking about? Yes, but more likely, and this is why we talk about these abnormally dangerous activities in this same context, unless they are very clear that we have the assumption of the risk, the person didn't assume the risk just because they put that on there as an answer choice. If the facts don't tell you that I did assume the risk, then we're still in this realm of strict liability. What does that mean? That means that if whatever happened, if the harm happened as a result of me engaging in this abnormally dangerous activity, just like with the wild animal piece, if I'm doing the thing, it is going to be strict liability. I am going to be liable for it. So to quickly kind of recap this brief section here, what are the two instances, and the only two instances really, where we want to automatically be thinking about strict liability? Wild animals and abnormally dangerous activities. So what is not a wild animal? Dog, cat, gerbil, right? The things that we normally, the pets that we normally keep as pets, right? Those animals. What is a wild animal? Everything else, right? Don't lose your common sense. If it's some crazy animal that you haven't heard of, they will tell you that it's a wild animal, essentially. But again, this is not the part we need to get hung up on. We need to understand, okay, if it's not a wild animal, what's the only situation where strict liability is going to attach to me? Is if that animal essentially becomes a wild animal, because there's a history of this animal being out of control and being violent. Okay, then we are going to treat that, what would have been a normal domestic animal, we're going to treat them as a wild animal, right? Then if we know we're dealing with a wild animal, either because it's a pet with a history of being out of control, or because it really is a bear or an elephant or whatever, and we see that some harm has materialized, it doesn't matter what precautions I took. And that's the important thing. They'll spend time telling you about all the precautions that I took to make this situation safe. Doesn't matter. If it's a wild animal and harm occurs to you because it's a wild animal, I'm going to be strictly liable. Does the wild animal have to bite you? No. Is that the simplest way that it's tested? Yes, of course. If the tiger bites you, strict liability, easy, done. Thank you for the point. What's more likely to happen is I've taken all these precautions, and I think, and it looks like from the facts, that the tiger's not going to hurt you. But you, even though you, prior to this moment, had never been afraid of tigers, when you actually see one in the flesh, you run away, and that's when you get hurt. Am I still strictly liable? Yes. Even though the tiger didn't bite you? Yes. Why? Because it's a wild animal. Wild animal equals strict liability. What's the only wild animal situation where strict liability is not going to attach? Is the situation where you didn't know it was a wild animal, right? The harm materialized and it would have happened anyway, regardless of whether or not there was a wild animal. So that's just one we need to be on the lookout for. That type of scenario where the harm materializes in some other way, there's some connection with the abnormally dangerous activities. So let's kind of shift to that, right? It's the exact same idea. If I'm engaged in abnormally dangerous activities, and they will tell you, right, they expect you to know that blasting things with dynamite, that's abnormally dangerous. But they will tell you if they're transporting chemicals, they'll say it's a dangerous chemical or whatever. You take that for what it is, close reading, right? If you recognize that we're transporting dangerous chemicals, but let's say that some harm occurs that has nothing to do with the abnormally dangerous chemicals. Let's say I'm the owner of the chemical company and the chemical transport company, and the driver of one of the trucks gets loaded and runs somebody over. And it has not, the chemicals didn't spill, there was nothing, the chemicals never got out of the truck. It's just, unfortunately, right, that this other thing happened. It had nothing to do with the chemicals. Is there going to be strict liability? No. Might that company still be liable? Sure, right? But then we're talking about a totally different issue. If we're talking about strict liability for the abnormally dangerous activities, as long as the harm resulted from whatever the activity was, and that plaintiff didn't assume the risk, and they would have to be very clear, they'll be very explicit if the plaintiff assumed the risk. But if we don't have assumption of the risk, strict liability as long as there's harm from that abnormally dangerous activity. So if we can keep this subset separate from the rest of the tort stuff, we begin to see, as I've said in a lot of the other torts content, that really this is just reading comprehension and being able to recognize the individual elements of each tort. Recognize that in a lot of these questions, all they're doing is mismatching elements of different torts. If we can keep it separate, we can keep it straight, we will have no problem. We will have no problem with this section of the bar exam. Anyway, until next time, guys, get at me with any questions that you have. I love each and every one of you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.